that takes us to the Minnesota Timberwolves, which I will give you their basics here now. Their key free agents, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, who I am trying to send everywhere as a value free agent. Jalen Noel also. NAW is restricted if I didn't mention that. Anthony Edwards, eligible for a max extension, probably going to get it. That's just under $200 million for 5 years. He can get the all NBA language that could raise that up to super max for just about $236 million. Jaden McDaniels is also extension eligible. Someone I would expect to get in the neighborhood of $100 million. We can discuss that. The Wolves have, they also did some business. They extended Naz Reid. So they got about 10 million they're within 10 million of the tax after that extension, without considering the holds for Alexander Walker and Jalen Noel. They're probably going to be a mid-level team. That looks like the likeliest outcome. They have a Jared Vanderbilt trade exception worth 4.4 million that expires on July 6th. So this team does not need another big, since they're spending like 400. There was somebody aggregated all the salaries. It was like 270 for Cat or 170 for him and 130 for. It's like several $100 million for 3 centers. So they don't need a center. So what else? What do they need? What are you looking at? And you're a Naz Reid guy more so than I am. So maybe before we talk about targets, how do you feel, if you haven't already discussed the Naz Reid deal looks?
I thought it was a bargain, and people are like, well, that's a lot to pay for a third big, and you don't get to evaluate him in the context of this roster that you built. It's what is he worth on the market? And I would have given him the full MLE. If I was like a team like, the Jazz, I would have looked at pairing him in the front court with, I know you just have Taylor Hendricks, but like him and Walker Kessler and Larry Markin, they could have worked together. He would have been perfect in Indiana. So there were teams that I think really could have used him, that maybe would have tried to even encroach with, sign and trade possibilities if they didn't have cap space, but had flexibility under the hard cap. And look, he can play with either one of these bigs if they really want to. I don't know, defensively, him and Towns will be rocky, but like he can play with Rudy Gobert, but he can still play with Towns. And I'm fine with the number. A lot of people are trying to connect the dots and say this means that the Wolves are going to trade Towns. I don't think re-signing Naz Reid is the impetus for you trading Karl-Anthony Towns. That I disagree with.
Do you think the Reid deal is more of an asset preservation move, as opposed to our vision is we will have 3 centers and we'll move? You know what I mean? Like, is it an asset thing, or is it we believe this guy will help us in ways X, Y, and Z?
It's probably a little bit of both, but it has to be on some level asset preservation, because I don't think you would have this much money invested in your 3 big. Like if you had Rudy Gobert and Karl-Anthony Towns, I don't think there was a scenario in which you thought that Naz Reid was going to be a mid-level type play. I don't think you make that trade otherwise. And now look, he's more valuable to them as a trade chip himself on this contract once he becomes trade eligible. That's just a number that can bring back more salary. And there aren't teams that are going to, you don't balk at that. Like if you want him, even if he's coming off the bench, like that's not the numbers that they have invested in bigs is ridiculous because of Gobert and Towns. It's like, if you're paying mid-level to your 3rd big, that's not really a huge deal anymore.
Yeah. I worry that I like Reid, maybe not quite as much as you. I worry that like if he is a backup, this is a lot of money for a backup center, even just a pure second stringer. But if he's like someone like, I'm trying to think of a comparison. Well, someone like the Kings thought Richaun Holmes was, and he was for a while, and you're paying him, 12-ish a year or 14 a year, and he's a starter and he's a plus starter, then this deal's great. If Reid is someone who can, if and when they trade him, can just, you slot in, you're going to play 28 minutes a game, maybe more as a starter. We're paying you this much. Like that works for me. But if he is, I don't know, just in that murky, morass of backup 5s that are not that, hard to, or are pretty indistinguishable from like minimum salary guys. You can go sign a guy off the scrap heap and he can give you 85% of what Reid does. Then it's rough. But if he's a starter, I think totally fine.
There's his floor game alone. We could talk about the floor spacing where it's, you can find bigs that'll take 3s. His floor game alone is just, and there's perimeter mobility on defense there. So I think it was a no-brainer for them. I don't think it informs what they're going to do in the front court one way or the other. I think I just think you keep him, you don't keep him. This was the right play for them. What do you think is the bigger need? They can use a backup point guard, but I also think they could use more. It doesn't have to be a part of their closing lineup. I know you have Anthony Edwards. I know you have Mike Conley. You have Naz Reid. You have Towns. But I do feel like they could use another wing shooter. Like they have a wing who's a shooter where it's Taurean Prince. And then I know a lot of people are high on Wendell Moore. I don't know how many minutes you're planning on having him play next year. And Jamie McDaniels, again, hit a high percentage of his threes, but I'm talking just like a caps lock shooter on the wings. And Anthony Edwards is more of an off the dribble guy. Taurean Prince is like the closest they sort of get to that. But I do see the argument for why just another backup playmaker behind Edwards and Conley would be people's prerogative to target.
Yeah, I think for me, it's probably the point guard spot. Although if Edwards is increasingly ready to do more on-ball stuff and just be the primary creator, which I think is sort of the end game with him, like a Donovan Mitchell type role, I think it would be the hope where he just does run your offense.
He might even be. I don't mean to. It might be more of a James Harden like role.
Yeah, sure.
Where he's just so, and I feel like we saw that at points last season. But please, I didn't mean to.
No. I think it is a very much an open question. Like, what kind of lead ball handler might he ultimately be? Like, I was just using Mitchell as the guy who, well, he's a 2. Maybe he's not a 2. Like, maybe he can run a bunch of pick and rolls to great success, at least this past season. So, and Conley's age and durability is obviously a concern. So, I think just to insulate yourself against, oh shit, Conley, is out for 4 to 6 weeks with whatever, and Anthony Edwards is just suddenly, maybe he's ready for it, but suddenly has this massive playmaking, ball handling role that is just, it's a lot to ask. So I think I'd probably focus on a backup, or maybe you'd even call it like a third point guard. You don't need to go crazy, and they can't, but you got to have somebody, I think, that you could throw out there for, a decent stretch of the season if you needed to, and feel like he's not going to just, the offense won't go off the rails.
My favorite target for that role, and it's with the mini MLE, Trey Jones. I don't know how much he costs. I'm assuming the Spurs would match anything in that area. And so after him, I really like the idea of Javon Carter here, assuming he opts out. And he's not much of a game manager, but just like he will give you 94 feet of defensive hellfire. And I would like, he can play off the ball, so you can play him with Edwards. I don't think you would play him with Conley at the same time. Like, you can play him with Kyle Anderson, have those type of outlets. I really love the fit with him. And if you want someone who is going to be more of a pick and roll player, I think Shake Milton for sure. That's just, and if people don't know about, and I blame them, like he was buried in the Sixers rotation, but like when they had injuries last year, he was capable of running some pick and rolls for Philadelphia. Yeah. So Shake Milton, that might be a minimum target, but Dennis Schroeder could be semi interesting here, right? In mini MLE territory. Like, you don't sacrifice anything. Like, he played some really pesky point of attack defense to the Lakers most of last season. Will get going downhill. I don't know how much you trust him as a shooter or a playmaker, but that might be an interesting name.
Yeah, I don't mind him, especially alongside either Edwards or Conley, right? Because you can, if this defense that he showed with the Lakers persists, you could just spare. I mean, Edwards, I think, has the capacity to become a great defender, but if you don't want him to have to handle that and run the offense, you throw Schroeder out there. I think Schroeder could guard some 2s if he's playing that position with Conley. So I like that a lot. If you're looking at wing shooting, though, you can't quite split the difference, but someone like Seth Curry, I don't know that the mini MLE is going to get there for him. He's a tricky player to try to evaluate. I think Schroeder's kind of the same way. Like, the mini MLE feels, especially if it's 7 or 8 or whatever million, which I don't think it'll get to 8, but it feels like that's right around where they should be. But it's hard to know if that's going to get it done if they have multiple offers. Like, is Minnesota the choice for those guys if they have more than one mini MLE offer? I don't know. I don't know if you mentioned Ayo Dosunmu restricted. Ooh. I don't know how the Bulls value him, but if Trey Jones is someone that gets the immediate match at the mini MLE level, I think Dosunmu could be interesting too.
I actually have him penciled in for a lot more teams now because Stefan Noah of Sporting News listed him among free agents every team could afford because, and he really covers the Bulls. And they have Kobe White as a free agent. They have Zach LaVine. They have Alex Caruso, Lonzo Balls on the books, DeMar DeRozan. So they're going to be up against tax concerns in a crowded backcourt. I thought it would take, he can only get the starting full, bigger MLE to start as a max salary. I thought it would take that at least, plus kind of a poison pill to get him out of Chicago. Apparently he might be way more accessible. And I'm just someone who could defend almost 1 through 4. And no, he's not a primary playmaker. His shooting fell off. He can put pressure on the basket and he can run the offense well enough if you give him space. I would love him basically on every single team at this point.
Well, I think too, you might look at it's hard to know how they do this, but it looks like the Wizards are very much open to moving anything. So Monte Morris, Monte Morris would be like pretty significantly overqualified for the role he'd play here. But that's, I mean, DeLon Wright, I think too, is another one that makes a lot of sense.
The only thing is the alarm went off. That's tricky, and they're just not built for a mid-end trade unless they're gonna, like, you could give Taurean Prince for Monte Morris, but is that a trade you're making? And you're not trading Kyle Anderson? You're like, you can't even step ladder your way there, really. So they're if they're gonna make a trade, it almost has to be a mega one. It feels like, without any picks involved. So, but I'm so interested to see what this team looks like at full strike next year, by the way, because we just didn't see it for enough this season.